So tonight we are right in the middle of a very important clash between the Trump administration and the courts. And it has been rapidly developing and escalating over the past 48 hours or so. As we talked about on Friday night's show, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a law that is a wartime law in this country. It's used during wartime only. The last time it was used was during World War II, when it was used to put Japanese Americans in internment camps, something for which the U.S. government later apologized and paid reparations under Ronald Reagan. Nevertheless, in an unannounced written statement this weekend, Donald Trump claimed that that was the law he would use as the basis for deporting people who he determined to be members of a Venezuelan gang. He would use that law to deport people immediately, without any due process or any legal consideration at all. Organizations, including the ACLU, sued immediately to block him from using that 1700s law. The chief judge of the Washington, D.C. Federal District Court held an emergency hearing on the ACLU's lawsuit late Saturday afternoon. And at that hearing, the ACLU's lawyer, Lee Gallant, told that judge that it was his understanding that planes were about to take off, or possibly had taken off during the hearing, carrying hundreds of men out of this country toward a prison in El Salvador. There was a Trump administration lawyer there representing the government. That lawyer said he couldn't give the judge any information about that at all. So again, this was an emergency hearing late on Saturday, and the judge ended up basically saying, listen, there are difficult questions of law here, and these are going to have to be worked out in the courts. For now, I am blocking the Trump administration from deporting people under this law from the 1700s. They are blocked from using this law as the basis for these deportations until we can hash out these legal questions. So the judge actually said to the Trump administration lawyer, quote, "You shall inform your clients," meaning inform the Trump administration, "of this immediately. You should inform them that any plane containing these folks that's going to take off or is in the air needs to be returned to the United States. Those people need to be returned to the United States. Quote, this is something that you need to make sure is complied with immediately." By all appearances, that order was not complied with immediately. NBC News reports that 2 flights carrying these men were in transit when the judge issued his ruling, but they did not turn around. They continued on their way. The Washington Post reports that a 3rd plane was still on the ground at the time of that ruling. It hadn't taken off in Texas until after that judge's ruling had been issued. The next morning, the pro-Trump president of El Salvador announced that his country had accepted 238 men from the United States. He posted a slickly produced 3-minute propaganda video of some of these men being sort of manhandled and pushed around, and all of them having their heads shaved by armed Salvadoran military or security forces. President Trump happily posted the video as well. The president of El Salvador says these men will be jailed in a massive prison in his country for as many years as the U.S. wants to pay him to keep them there. They have not been charged with crimes and thereby sentenced to serve this time. They're just being locked up indefinitely at the pleasure of El Salvador. At the White House press briefing today, Trump's press secretary listed all the crimes these men ostensibly committed, but a senior Trump administration official tells NBC News that these men have not necessarily been convicted of any of these crimes. Still, though, they're in prison now in El Salvador indefinitely, having been disappeared out of this country with no process whatsoever. We don't even know who these guys are. They keep saying they're Venezuelan gang members. We don't even know if they're Venezuelans, let alone gang members. Unsurprisingly, the federal judge who held that hearing on Saturday, where he made it abundantly clear that nobody was supposed to be sent to El Salvador, he called a new hearing today to assess whether the Trump administration had knowingly violated his court order. Quote, a federal judge pressed a Justice Department lawyer today over why the Trump administration did not comply with his order to temporarily halt deportations under an 18th century law, and asked why key information about the flights was being withheld over the weekend. In a tense hearing, the judge summarized the administration's position on his court order Saturday as, quote, we don't care, we'll do what we want. The Trump administration lawyer at this evening's hearing still refused to provide any information about the flights. And so the judge has now ordered another hearing for tomorrow at noon, at which the Trump administration must give him the information he wants or explain the legal rationale for why they are not giving it to him. And if they don't, then, well then. Hanging in the balance immediately is the fate of untold numbers of people who Donald Trump may try to send to this Salvadoran prison. The president of El Salvador has said openly that he'd be happy to put U.S. citizens there too. But also hanging in the balance is whether the Trump administration is considering not just trying to wheedle their way out of it, but whether they're considering openly flouting a court order, which is a very fast trip down a very short street in terms of how much of a republic we still are. An internal Social Security Administration memo sent Thursday last week details proposed changes to the claims process that would debilitate the agency, cause significant processing delays, and prevent many Americans from applying for or receiving benefits. The biggest change contemplated in the memo is to require internet identity proofing for any benefit claims made over the phone. If a Social Security recipient is unable to utilize internet ID proofing, customers will be required to visit a field office to provide in-person identity documentation. Many people served by the Social Security Administration cannot access the internet. Under the new system, this would force these populations to visit an office to have their claims processed. The memo estimates it would require 75,000 to 85,000 in-person visitors per week to Social Security offices to implement this policy. Social Security offices currently do not have the resources to handle an influx of in-person appointments of this size. They're cutting 7,000 staffers. They're shutting dozens of field offices. They're ending in-person services at some offices altogether. And even before those changes take effect, Social Security offices no longer accept walk-ins. And right now, the wait time for an appointment averages over 1 month. Joining us now is Judd Legum. He's writer of the independent newsletter Popular Information. He's the first person to obtain this memo from Social Security. Judd, thanks very much for being with us. Thank you for this reporting.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, Rachel.
This just seems like, I know we've heard of a lot of changes and proposed changes at Social Security that are freaking a lot of people out, people who are recipients of Social Security in particular. This seems so unbelievably impractical to me. It's hard for me to believe that this is a real prospect that's still on the table. Do you think that it is?
Yes, I know that it is, based on the people that I'm talking to on Social Security. This is something that's moving through Social Security very aggressively. And the people who are concerned about this memo, who brought it to light, believe that it is an effort to break the agency. And this is a huge influx of people to these offices that are already under strain, that are now getting, as you mentioned, many of them are getting closed. There's just no way for them to deal with the number of people who would now need to come into the office to verify their identification under this new proposal.
Is there any corresponding sort of implementation memo, right? If they're saying internally and officially at Social Security that this would result in 80,000 more people needing to use field offices per week, is there also implementation work being done to scale up the capacity of the field offices to be able to do that?
No, in fact, it's just the opposite. They're closing down the field offices. One of the things that's remarkable, as they're taking away the ability to do the things you need to do, like file a claim, which is probably the most important thing, over the phone, they're actually converting some of these field offices to phone only. So they're taking away the in-person services. So I think, this is an effort to really strain the agency beyond what it can handle. And one thing I want to note is 75 to 85,000 people coming to the office. Those are actually the lucky ones, because as Social Security kind of elliptically notes in this memorandum, there are vulnerable populations who cannot get physically to an office because they are elderly or disabled in a way that prevents them from traveling. Sometimes you have to travel over 100 miles to get to a local office. It's not always around the corner.
And that's even before they start shutting down dozens of them. Judd Legum, writer of the independent newsletter Popular Information. We subscribe here at The Rachel Maddow Show, and it's a really great resource. You're doing great work there, Judd. Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll be right back.